Welcome back to Cards and Comics, guys. Today I'm going to be talking again about 90s cards, but a little different spin today. It's a topic that I've heard a lot. I've heard from dealers, I've heard at the National. Um, Sports Card Dad, Dustin just did a video on his channel about this topic, which is, are 90s cards a bubble? Is this false demand, speculative demand that's going to eventually burst? And we've seen it before. It's a little deja vu for people who are in this hobby for a while, because we did see an issue in the 90s where we had a boom and bust, a bubble that did bust in the 90s. So this seems like it could happen all over again, right? But based on what I collect and what you maybe know about my channel, probably think we're probably going to guess I'm going to have a different take. But I want to show some data and some thoughts around why I don't think it's a bubble, and we'll go through it, and we'll start right now. So the first thing we got to look at is what is a bubble for a collectible market, right? And I used a lot of information from Sean from Reserved Investments. So if you are really interested in the antiques market and sort of how the more mature collectible markets compare to maybe more speculative markets like sports cards, comic books, things that are maybe a little bit newer, not Victorian age antiques or money or swords, right? I mean, those things are a lot more mature than sports cards. He's got a great channel that talks about these things, and I learned a lot from him. So I'm gonna put some of it on paper here, but also my spin on some of these things as well, and some of my thoughts from other resources, some other things I've read. So again, a collectible bubble bursts, or a bubble occurs when an item exceeds the intrinsic value by a large margin. Now, a lot of definitions are based on things like stock market and things that have some inherent value, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, the idea here is that, you know, speculation causes prices to increase, and they increase to a point to where eventually people can't afford it or don't want to pay it anymore, or people realize, it's not worth that. And then there's a big price collapse. And this is what happens when the burst happens, right? There is this big run up. People get really exuberant about something. It's new. It's, something that they maybe collected as a kid. There's a lot of nostalgia with it. We'll talk about nostalgia. And then, at some point, there isn't any more demand because it was speculators and a few people really propping up the prices, and then there's a big collapse, right? And in general, the thing with 90s cards that's great about is we don't have to worry about increased demand for, or supply for, some of the products, and I'll talk about that in a minute, about supply and demand. But in general, like in the modern collecting market, where it's a lot more speculative driven, manufacturers can manufacture more, right? Because there's more demand. Speculation drives demand. Demand creates more product. More product creates, more stuff, and then eventually the weight of everything kind of collapses on itself. Because eventually supply outstrips demand, right? And there's not enough real collectors at some point, because the speculators eventually leave the market, and then collectors, there's not enough to hold the bag, and things collapse, right? That is normally what happens. So what drives value in a 90s sports card? Like, so we talked about intrinsic value. Well, unfortunately, sports cards in general have no intrinsic value. They're not backed by anything. We talk about this a lot in this hobby, that there is nothing to protect any one of us in this hobby from, things like shenanigans, things like people, ripping you off. Shill bidding is a good example, right? You can say it's against the law, but in general, it's very difficult to get anyone to pay attention to you for getting shill bid in eBay auction, right? There's so many things you can do to manipulate prices, because there's no real rules. It's the Wild West. And in the end, whatever someone's willing to pay for something is kind of what it's worth. There's no utility, right? This isn't like something you need. It's not food. It's not clothing. It's not a car. So you can't say it has something that you can use, other than maybe to build a shelter with if you have enough of this. But other than that, it's really low utility. and no real intrinsic value. So, what causes sports cards to have any value, right? Well, there's some factors. First of all, we'll go into, what type of market are sports cards, especially 90s sports cards. Speculative, established, mature. And then, what I think really drives value and what causes the 90s cards to rise above the typical, like, the speculative bubble is the rarity, the historical relevance, the nostalgia, the design, the uniqueness of design, and it's in their overall collectability that they have something to them that makes people want to collect them, right? So we'll move on to, you know, um, one of the caveats here, and I talked about it a little earlier, was, are we seeing history repeat, right? So we saw a big run up of speculation. And to me, growing through it, through the 80s and 90s, I don't remember, and I didn't collect heavily in the 70s, so maybe someone can correct me, but in general, the 80s, when the rookie card craze had really driven by a couple products, and you had, like, for 3 years in a row, or 4 years in a row, if really you look at it, really big rookie classes. So you had, Cal Ripken, then you had Wade Boggs, Tony Gwynn, you had the 83 class, Tony Gwynn, Ryan Sandberg. Then you had 84. You had, Don Mattingly. You had Dwight Gooden. You had Kirby Puckett in 84 and 85. Darryl Strawberry. So again, you had multiple years of rookie cards in big key markets, right? That really drove a lot of speculation. And I remember reading stories in, like, Baseball Card Magazine and Beckett, where people were saying, like, I sold my all my 50s cards to buy 80s cards, right? Which is very similar. Like I just said that when I'm selling 50s cards to buy 90s cards, right? But that's what people were doing in the 80s, right? Buying 80s cards with monies from the 50s. And you had people doing the opposite too. You had, I have collector friends of mine that said they knew how to search packs back in the day to find the Goodens and the Strawberry rookie cards, and then they would sell them to dealers and buy 50s cards. So you had a lot of stuff going on, but you couldn't do that without a lot of speculation, right? With a lot of things happening in the market that would allow that to occur from a high demand, a lot of speculation. Because again, these cards in the 80s, were based on rookies that were not proven. And you had in basketball Michael Jordan, which just created a whole new craze when his playing and his cards took off. You had, the late 80s, early 90s cards just go nuts for him. But when the 90s hit, that craze from the rookie card craze, you had King Griffey Jr. in 89, Frank Thomas in 90. So it kind of continued. Then you had all this crazy 90s cards, but then you had something happen. You had new manufacturers enter. So you had, again, in the 80s, you had Fleer and Donner Center. In the 90s, you had Upper Deck, you had Skybox, you had Pinnacle. You had a ton of new sets and designs and manufacturers, and it's just like year after year. And in fact, when I look at the amount of wax boxes or types of, let's say, sets being made in a wax box from the 1990 to 1999, every year it's kind of like this, just almost like a straight curve, like this logarithmic curve, where the amount of product every year just kept growing and growing. And then you had stores popping up everywhere. So all this demand, all this speculation demand, eventually collapsed. And then, stores went bankrupt, manufacturers went bankrupt. And to this day, and this is kind of what puts a bad taste in people's mouth about the 90s, is there's, warehouse after warehouse of these 90s products, of some of these 90s products. And we'll make a clarification a little bit. But again, the big joke in the hobby was for decades, someone brought a collection to a card show or to a dealer. Good chance it was going to be a collection full of 90s cards because they were so overprinted, the majority of them. And so it makes you wonder, like, what makes people want to invest in the 90s cards, right? We already saw this issue of a price collapse, the market already collapsed. Well, let's go back and look at it in totality as far as just what kind of market we are in, right? So, Sean and some other books I've read talk about what kind of markets are speculative, established, and mature. And so, in my opinion, there's three different types of sports cards markets that are out there. The speculative market, and again, it's defined by less than 30 years of demand. So, like cards haven't, have been collected less than 30 years. It's usually driven by artificial scarcity. It's very speculative, meaning that the cards are going to be held less than 5 years. Low barrier to entry, meaning like, think about, right now to get into the modern market, you really can get into breaks, right? And you can pay, 20, 50, $100 to get into a break and get a chance of getting a high end, super duper modern card. And that kind of thing creates a bubble, right? Because people are exuberant, they're very, gung ho. It's almost, very gambling like, to get in these markets. So the modern market is very speculative. In the old chart downstairs, down below, I have, the Mike Trout, because that's a great example of a card that no one thought could lose value. No one thought they were speculating when they bought Mike Trout, and then we found out later on that we could lose value on a Mike Trout. You could have a card like that was printed in extreme numbers, lose value, and everyone who was kind of that 80s and 90s memory was like, no, it's a base card. Don't spend thousands of dollars on a base card. Well, we are where we are, and so that's really a speculative market. Cards that have a 30 to 50 years history of being collected, they're more established. So I think the 90s cards are hitting that 20. There's 25 to 30 plus years of collectability and collecting of 90s cards, and values can change. That's something with established markets. That's a very common definition, is that certain cards, certain sets will change in value, meaning like cards that were not worth much before become very expensive, cards that were very expensive become worth less. But it's driven by real scarcity, right? And collectability. So real scarcity means that there's physically less cards, or let's say there's so much less cards printed of the cards that are collectible, that it creates an issue where they're hard to find. That drives value because they're collectible, they look cool, people want them. They're players that they like, and they're hard to find because they actually are printed in numbers that make them hard to get, and that creates scarcity. Now, again, with 90s cards, the cards that we're talking about, they're very collectible. The rare cards, the cards that were shorter printed, there is a higher barrier to entry than the modern cards, because I can't, in most cases, pay $10 to $20 than try to get into a case break of, Metal Universe to try to get a PMG. For one thing, there's like one in a box. So it's like the chance I really love getting it. But even if I went and bought a box, it's the prices on some of the really high stuff is a little bit higher for the really good stuff. So I would also make the argument, though, is that with modern cards, the speculation is so intense right now, and the prices of modern cards are so high. 90s cards are still, in some cases, a better value and deal. So there's a little bit of a weirdness there between the two markets, and which is why I view kind of like maybe 90s cards haven't fully hit that established market yet. There's still some speculation, but it's just like also, where the money's at, and there's a lot of money being poured into modern cards today. And then the mature markets, again, vintage, right? You look at vintage cards. I mean, there's pre-war cards. There's been cards since the 1800s. So, and that market is established. You can look at collecting magazines from the 1950s. Handwritten, typewritten letters to collectors to each other, trying to find T cards and rare sets in the pre-war era. People were collecting cards. There was price guides put out there, all kinds of stuff in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's very well established that vintage sports cards, pre-war cards especially, had a long history of being collectible. And I think that makes them at least fit the definition of a lot of history of collectability. some of the massively most expensive collectibles on the marketplace are sports cards. So to me, it'd be hard to convince me that it was that vintage sports cards are speculative or even established market. To me, it's a very mature market, and it would be very tough for me to think that the Honus Wagner card is going to go to zero at some point. So I think these are the definitions we're going to work with, where 90s cards have kind of separated from the pack and formed its own little class of cards. And you could throw some 80s cards in there. Again, it's really tough because, again, some 80s cards, like the Star Jordan would be a good example of an actual rare card from the 80s that could fit this definition as well. But there's not as many because, again, a lot of cards in the 80s are just base cards. There was no short prints. You can look at Tiffany sets as a good example of maybe a short printed version of cards. But again, they're few and far between. So then we get into, rarity. I just talked about it a little bit. But again, not every card from the 90s is collectible. And this is why when people talk about the bubble and talk about, this is all happening again like it did back in, 1999, 2000, 97, when things really started to fall apart. We saw the first really signs of it, is that there's real scarcity for the most part in the 90s that is undisputable. It's like there's cards with stated odds, serial number, there's 101s, there was certifiable, historically documented short printed cards from the 90s that have very low print runs that make them harder to get. So they are truly scarce. They're not based on grading like the 89 Upper Deck Griffey to be rare. The PSA 10 Griffey is rare, but again, that card was printed in the millions. So that's a big distinction, guys, is that card is artificially rare based on grading compared to the card that has 10 copies total, 5 copies. The Bowman Chrome Anniversary Refractors, 5 copies. There are printing plates. There are some 101s, the Fleer master showcase masterpieces, right? 101s. So those are truly hard cards to find. So, but again, a majority, like 99% of cards from the 90s were regular cards that were overprinted. And again, those cards formed that bubble that did pop. So you look at it like this. In general, the junk wax cards tainted the 90s as a whole. And that really stuck for a lot of years. There were, outside of basketball and Jordan, there were player collectors who were very passionate about Griffey and a few players, but it took a long time for the taint of that junk wax era to really absolve itself. And you're seeing people my age coming back and saying, I love these cards as a kid. They actually are rare, and I'm willing to put some money into them, right? And that's what we're seeing now, because collectible cards in the 90s, for the most part, were in limited runs. And they are not the cards that we're talking about when we say the 90s collapse, right? It's not these. These are not the culprits of that, a disaster in the 90s. So again, historical relevance here. So what I'm talking about here is that, for better or worse, and in some cases I can see it for worse, that the innovations of the 90s that started in the 90s, that began in the 90s, are what people are still collecting today. Those designs, those innovations are relevant. There's one-to-one, relationships to cards made in the 90s and cards being collected today. So, and the fact that the 90s were so incredibly competitive, tons of manufacturers that they had to one-up each other, and that's how these innovations happened. And one of the things I always complain about modern cards is that with very little competition between the companies like Fanatics or Panini, innovation has truly been pretty lackluster to none for the hobby. Now, and sometimes the innovation was so crazy that we've lost the technology, right? There's some cards that can't even be made today. But, innovations from the 90s that, again, have an impact on today's market. Refractors, still hugely popular. refractors became Panini Prisms, right? It's the same idea, same card, just different manufacturers. The short print parallel. So this is where you get into like, oh my gosh, you have the card numbered out of 100, card numbered out of 25, a card numbered out of 50. It's the same card. This is sort of was exciting in the 90s. That's where things are super collectible in the 90s. People love those cards. But in the modern world, we're seeing this proliferation and just a way to create artificial value, I think, in a lot of products. And so it's turned into kind of an evil of the hobby today, where in the 90s it was still fresh and still pretty new. And it wasn't overdone to the point that we see it today, where there's like 42 different parallels in the set. A lot of times in the 90s, you maybe had 2 or 3 parallels in the set max. Game use, jersey cards, right? Autograph jersey cards, autograph rookie cards, the things that people love today, RPAs. Those things started in the 90s. Serial number cards, like really, it wasn't until the 90s where they got good at this and figured out how to do this. And then the idea of 101s. Printing plates, masterpieces, those things became, superfractors and, whatever Panini has out there as 101s. It's just that started it in the 90s. So those things are super relevant today. So again, you have all this kind of like, rarity, historical relevance, but the main argument against the 90s bubble, or that we are in a 90s bubble, is this. Number one argument is that it's a bunch of 40-plus-year-old dudes who are just nostalgic about these cards, and they're willing to overpay to relive their childhood, but at some point, they're going to either get bored, move on to something else, and then modern collectors won't care about those cards. They won't care about Ken Griffey Jr. or Frank Thomas or Jeff Bagwell or Greg Maddux and those players and those designs, the designs that aren't, let's say, say 1-to-1 with something being made today, like refractors and prisms, then those cards will just go away. They'll kind of, fade away into obscurity. And that the only reason the prices are so high today is because people are speculating. They're trying to get into the market so they can flip the cards. They're thinking like, okay, I can get into this one market that's hot. I'll hoard some cards, hold them for a while, and then sell them. I'll make some money and get out. And then those cards will collapse in price after I get out, and I'll make my money. And then the collectors who bought at the higher prices will be left holding cards that aren't worth as much in the future because we just pump and dump, right? That's the general argument on why we're in a bubble, and eventually it's going to pop. But the thing is, again, nostalgia is driving that because, again, we're talking about the speculators taking advantage of the 40-plus-year-old collectors who just got back into it, or the guys who are just reliving the childhood. The 40-plus-year-old guys are the guys who have money now, like they have gone through, let's say, buying their first house and kids going to college and all this other stuff, and they have extra money. That's the people, let's say, buying the cards today. But the argument against it is that the same argument about people won't care about the hobby or care about those cards or care about those sets has been made every generation since the 80s about pre-war, about 50s cards. Those cards are still expensive. They've gone up in value tremendously in the last 20 years. Like, I think can we put that narrative to bed that no one cares about Mickey Mantle, no one cares about Babe Ruth, those cards will go to zero. That's been the argument for decades, and it's still not true. And I think that's going to be the same argument on these 90s cards. Ken Griffey Jr. is going to carry relevance, just like Michael Jordan, into the future. And then, current 90s card buyers are, for the most part, collectors, right? So that's the thing that's also very different is that you have a tremendous amount of collecting communities. The one thing I would say about, and I mentioned Jordan and Griffey here, is that in the 2000s, the chat rooms I was in, the message boards I was in, Freedom Cardboard, Blowout forums, PSA forums, all these forums, you had a huge, active 90s sports card community, Griffey community, Jordan community that was constantly collecting, constantly talking to each other. It was hundreds of people, right, doing this activity. which means that there's probably thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people doing this because not everyone's going to be on a message board. It just shows you that it's always been there. There's been a high level of collectability and people collecting these players and these sets since the 90s. So I would just say that this isn't like, speculators, only speculators buying cards and driving prices. It's a tremendous amount of collectors, new or old, that's doing this, right? And again, Jordan Griffey, I think everything in the world would have to go to zero before you see Jordan Griffey cards again go down to zero, just like with Griff, or just like with Ruth and Mantle again, still going to be relevant 50 years from now. One of my biggest, things I think that people don't give the 90s enough credit for is designs and uniqueness. Again, we talked about modern card designs were created in the 90s. But again, many of the card designs in the 90s cannot be duplicated. They cannot be duplicated due to either lost technology or it's too expensive. And I think this makes the 90s so cool to collect, is because you're going to see things in the 90s when you really get into it that show you why modern cards kind of sometimes are very boring, or things that we used to have in the 90s we don't have today that made those cards so incredibly cool just to see and touch. So Dufex, lost technology, right? The last Dufex set came out in 2005. And from what I understand, that printing technology, the companies who were involved in that generally don't do it anymore, don't exist. So to go back and redo it, you'd have to build, that whole process again from scratch. And I don't think any manufacturer is going to do that just to have, a random technology that was used, 19 years ago in card making. I just don't see them doing that. The etching on chrome and finest cards. I don't know people who collect Prism cards today or cards today, but the finest and chrome cards back in the old days used to have these, lines you could feel on the cards that, we called them etching, and that made the cards have, during when they became refractors, a lot more like depth and uniqueness to them. Those etching, they're very flat today. If you look at most chrome and finest cards today, they almost look like foil. They have very little or zero amount of etching. So again, and that's because it was too expensive to do. And they felt like, well, no one cares, but I cared. A lot of collectors cared. Embossing, the die cut refractors from 97, again, too expensive. I'm not sure they can even do it anymore. Again, those are double-sided refractors. When's the last time you saw a double-sided refractor? Can they even do that today? Crazy die cuts. We talked about, if you go back and look at the crazy cool die cuts that they had in the 90s, you don't hardly see anything like that today. I've seen some cool die cuts in the 90s, but man, you had them, in modern cards, but man, in the 90s, you had all kinds of crazy stuff. And then just, insert designs that were just, almost like, just like people just threw stuff at the wall and then I see what stuck. Some really awesome stuff and some really ugly stuff, but it was always super innovative and just kind of, insane. And, here are some examples like, Dufex here, the Clout 9 Griffey that, in hand, this is one of the most beautiful cards ever made. Even the photo here doesn't really do it justice. The 99 embossed, the 99 domed holographic gold from Stars and Steel, one of my favorite sets, putting it together. It's domed, it's metal, it's refractory, double-sided refractory. It's got like 8 or 9 technologies all in one card. It's just a crazy card. The 97 finest gold embossed, like it's embossed, it's refractor, it's a cool pattern, it's die cut, it's double-sided. It's just like, 6 technologies all in one to make a card. Okay. And then, crazy die cuts cut above. So again, just some examples of the craziness of cards from the 90s of cool design. I just don't think that the people who talk about bubble bursting, talk about, people just, are speculating in the 90s, don't realize that these cards are so cool looking that there's just an immense amount of people who just think the cards are cool and want to collect them. And that leads to the next one, collectability. I just talked about it, but there's so many ways that people collect cards from the 90s. There's player collectors, set collectors, rookie card collectors, team collectors, type collectors, right? I'm a type collector. I try to buy all Griffey refractors. That's one of my goals, to have all of the base Griffey, all Griffey refractors and all of his base autos. I'm not sure I'm going to go after the super rare autos, but I think I can get all of his regular base autos in all the refractors except for maybe a few, like maybe the golden anniversary, that's number to 5. But I think I can get like 99% of them. And that's the thing that also, is that to think about is that you can, in the 90s, as a player collector, have a shot of getting a majority of that player's cards. Now, you may not be able to get the printing plates and the masterpieces and all that, but in general, the cards are hard to get. A lot of cards are number 100 or less that are tough to get, but you can still find them. You can collect them. And that makes it fun because they're rare, but they're not impossible, right? They're challenging, but you can still find them. They get more expensive the more, challenging they are, but you can still find some of them, like, established number of 100. Very awesome set. But, you can still find them. It's not like they're impossible to find, but they're rare. And again, there's so many variety of designs that you can collect something that maybe other people don't care about. I talked about, I collect leaf fractal matrices. I collect the Ultimate Victory 100 parallel, which isn't very popular. I got the Griffey and a few, and the Frank Thomas, and I can pick up Hall of Famers in the $20 to $40 range. It's not as popular as gold embossed refractors, star and ruby cards, PMGs. But to me, I like them, and it's fun because I can get a lot of cool Hall of Famers at a good price. That's me buying cards and collecting cards because I like that card other people don't. It's personal taste. You can do a lot of that in the 90s. There's so much out there to collect. You can find your niche and find cards you love that maybe other people don't, and you can get good deals and not have to pay a ton of money for those cards. And again, some sets were made only one time. I show the established Jeter here because that established card was only made one time in the history of cards. Will Upper Deck or will someone come back and redo the set? Maybe. I don't know. It could happen. All cards could be reprinted on design. But I will tell you this. Every time a manufacturer goes back and tries to redo the technology, they always do it, I won't say wrong, but it is wrong. They don't go all the way, right? They don't do double-sided refractors. They don't do the die cuts right. They don't have the etching. And this card here has double-sided refractors. It is such a deep refractor when you hold it in your hand. It's so unique how it's made. There's no way they're going to do that. I'm just going to tell you, they redo this card somehow. Upper Deck, sells flares rights to somebody like Panini or Topps, and they redo the set. Super long shot. But let's say they do all that, they're not going to get it right. So this card probably will only be printed the way it was printed back in 1999 one time. Makes it pretty cool. And that's why it's unique. And I think that makes people want to collect these kind of cards. So in summary, I know I spent a lot of time talking about it, but I just want to get to, the summary, which is like, there's many attributes about 90s cards that don't fit this bubble analogy, that it's a market getting ready to crash. So let's just summarize it, right? 25 to 34 years of collecting, of people buying these cards, collecting these cards consistently for that many years. It's not speculative. This isn't being driven by people just pumping and dumping. Modern card designs are still historically relevant to today's cards. People going back, and this isn't like going back and buying a Cracker Jack card from the 1915 set, or buying a Gaudi card that's really tiny compared to modern card and shiny. There's shiny, cool cards in the 90s just like they are today. They're one-to-one. So modern card collectors it's not a huge leap to go from a Prism card to a Topps Chrome card from the 90s. High amount of nostalgia by a lot of collectors who now have the means to go out and buy these cards. They are the target demographic that has right now the most collecting money being spent. So they are driving this price point. They are collecting for the most part. There are some speculation. I'm not going to say there's not, but there's a lot of collecting going on. True scarcity, serial number cards, 101s. There was cards in the 90s that were shorter printed. They do exist. Small fraction was made, but those are the cards that's driving the market. Unique designs only available in the 90s, and collectability of the cards is very high in multiple ways. So again, whether or not you believe the 90s cards are a bubble or not, my takeaway from just doing this for so long, I am the target demographic. I grew up in the 90s, collect these cards for majority of my collecting life. I would just say that when I see collectors at shows, the passion of these Facebook groups, the passion of these collectors, the people really buying these cards and paying these prices because we all kind of know who they are after these auctions end, it is not going to go away anymore soon. This is a super passionate community. This is something that people love to do because they just love collecting the cards. So I think this is going to continue to grow. Is there going to be ebbs and flows? Certain sets go up, certain sets go down, certain players go up, certain players go down. Yes, that's always going to happen in these markets. It doesn't mean that it's a bubble. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation format. I'm changing how I do some of my videos. Let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.